my name is Amanda and welcome to the next video tutorial in my Half Square Triangle Sampler Quilt Along series. So now that we have all 9 blocks in the series made, it's now time to sash them all together, put a border all around them to complete our quilt top, which you can see here in the background behind me. And doesn't it look awesome? Oh my gosh, I love it. So the fabric that I've used to sash and border my quilt top is the same that I've been using as the background colour in my blocks, and that fabric is this one. This is the Blue Skies Solid from RJF Fabrics as part of their Supreme Cottons range. As you can see, I don't really have very much left, but I did have enough to complete the quilt top, which was a very good thing. So the amount that I've calculated for the sashing and borders is about 1 meter to 1.2 meters, which is a little over a yard, or about 40 to 47 inches. You will need a continuous cut of fabric, usually from the bolt or from a roll, because in this case we're using the width of the fabric as our length. I think that made sense, but I think you'll pick it up as we go along. So to add just a little bit more interest to the quilt top, I've added in these little squares in the sashing around the middle block. I think you can see them here. Look, there's one, and oh, there's one, and there's one, and there's one in that crease there. But the fabric that I've used for that one is this one from the Sultan's Garden range. This is called the Stripe. I really wanted to incorporate this fabric within the quilt top because I'm using it for the binding. I wanted it to all sort of link together and flow, and I didn't just want to have like this odd fabric around the edges as the binding. I want it to be incorporated in the center as well, so that's why I've incorporated this fabric as little squares in the center. As always, you will be able to find all of the measurement and cutting instructions down in the description box below. You'll also find everything that you need to know on the pattern sheet as well. There's also a lovely layout diagram of where all of your sashing strips need to go, where all the border pieces need to go, so you can have a lovely quilt top looking the same as mine. So please, if you get confused at all throughout the tutorial, please look back at the diagram that I've put on the pattern sheet, and I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to sort of figure it out and get a gist of what I'm trying to talk about in the tutorial. So without rambling on any longer than I need to, here are the steps on how to sash and border your quilt top together. So before we get into sashing our blocks, place all 9 of them together and decide on the final layout that looks best to you. I chose to lay out mine so that the blocks with the seam fabrics in them weren't placed near each other. Once your layout is finalised, cut 12.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangles from your background fabric and 4 2.5 inch squares from a matching fabric. In this case, I'm using the same fabric I'll be using for the binding. So starting at the top, take the first block in the row and evenly line up a sashing strip along the right side of the block. Pin the edges together and then sew it into place using a 1/4 inch seam and making sure all seams underneath are lying flat before sewing over them. Next, set the seam with a medium to hot steamy iron and then gently press the seam inwards towards the sashing. Take the next block in the row and flip it over onto the sashing strip. Once even, pin the edge into place and then sew a 1/4 inch seam along it. Gently press the seam in the same way as before, inwards towards the sashing strip. Next, take another sashing strip and pin it evenly into place on the right hand side of the second block. Sew another 1/4 inch seam down this side, ensuring all seams on the back are lying flat as you sew over them. Carefully press the seam inwards towards the sashing strip. Then take the last block in the row, flip it over onto the sashing and pin it evenly into place. Sew one more 1/4 inch seam along this edge and then gently press the seam towards the sashing strip. And then from here, repeat the same set of steps to sash together the other 2 rows of blocks. Once all 3 rows of blocks have been sashed, it's time to make the 2 sashing rows that will bring all 3 rows of blocks together. To do this, take one of the leftover sashing strips and place 2 of the 2.5 inch squares on either end. Flip each one over and pin them into place. Sew a 1/4 inch seam along each end and then press the seams inwards towards the sashing strip. From here, pin a sashing strip to either end of the squares. And then sew a 1/4 inch seam down each side. Finally, press the seams inwards again towards the sashing strips. Repeat the same set of steps to make the second sashing row, and then place all of the rows together to see how everything is coming along. Next, take the top and the first sashing row and lay them out together. Flip the sashing row over onto the bottom edge of the first, and then turn the rows around so that the sashing row is now at the top. Line up and nest the seams of the squares with the sashing strips below them, and then patiently pin the whole edge evenly into place. Take the pinned rows to the sewing machine and slowly sew a 1/4 inch seam along the whole edge. Again, making sure all open seams underneath are lying flat as you feed it through. Then, after setting the seam, gently press it inwards towards the sashing row. With the rows placed back in their original order, lay out the second row of blocks. Flip it over and roughly line it up so that the edges match up with the sashing row underneath. Spin the row around again so that the bottom edge of the second row is now at the top. Then, like before, line up and neatly nest together the seams of the squares and sashing strip underneath. Pin the entire edge securely into place and then patiently sew a 1/4 inch seam down this side. Then, like before, gently press the seam towards the sashing row. And from here, repeat the same set of steps to attach the second sashing row and the third row of blocks together, completing the first step in finishing the quilt top. Next is to add on the borders. So for the borders, take your leftover background fabric and cut 5 5¼ inch strips from across the width of the fabric. Set aside 3 of the border strips, and then starting with the left hand vertical side of the pieced rows, carefully trim down any excess from the ends of the sashed rows with a ruler and blade. Then evenly place a border strip along the edge of the pieced rows, ensuring that there is enough overhang at each end. Patiently pin the entire edge together and then slowly sew a 1/4 inch seam along it, making sure that all seams underneath are lying flat before sewing over them. Then gently press the seam outwards towards the border strip. Then on the opposite side, trim down any overhang from the sashing rows, and then pin on another border strip in the same way as before. Sew another 1/4 inch seam down this edge and making sure all seams are flat before feeding them through. Then press the seam outwards again towards the border strip. Before moving on to sewing the last 2 border strips, take your ruler and blade and carefully trim off the excess from either side of the border strips, so that you have a nice clean edge to line up and sew the border to. To do this, evenly line up the lines on your ruler with the top of the border strip, add its seam line, and then along the right hand edge to achieve a precise straight cut. The next thing we need to do is extend the last 2 border strips so that they'll be long enough to sew onto the top and bottom edges of the quilt top. So to do this, cut one of the 3 leftover border strips in half with fabric scissors, resulting in 2 half border strips. Next, take a longer border strip and trim off the selvage from one side. Pair this with one of the shorter border strips and then pin them together. After repeating the same set of steps with the leftover longer and shorter border strips, take them both to the sewing machine, sew a 1/4 inch seam down each of the pinned edges, and then finally gently press each seam open with the iron. Now lay out your quilt top and place one of the border strips along the top edge, making sure that there is enough overhang on either side and that the open seam is facing upwards. Like before, patiently pin the edges evenly into place and then slowly sew a 1/4 inch seam along it. Smoothly press the seam outwards towards the border strip and then repeat the same steps again to attach the last border strip to the bottom edge of the quilt top. Then, after giving the quilt top a good press, carefully trim off the excess from either side of the border strips, resulting in a crisp, squared up quilt top that measures approximately 50 inches by 50 inches. Huzzah! There is our lovely quilt top all done and beautiful and lovely. I'm so happy with the way that mine has turned out, and I cannot wait to see how your quilt tops turn out. I think they're just going to be absolutely brilliant. I cannot wait to see them. Big apologies for taking forever to get this video out. I've just had the worst week last week with sickness and everything else, but I'm doing okay now, and I just want to say thank you to everyone for your awesome patience. And funnily enough, it's actually been a good thing because a lot of people have taken the time to catch up on finishing all of their blocks, so yay, that's so great. And so now that this video is out, you can now stash them all together and have a beautiful quilt top. Yeah! So the next few steps that I will be showing you in the next video next week is how to baste it all together and then quilt it. I actually don't know how I'm going to quilt this one. I just haven't really thought about it. I don't know, I'll have to take some time to think about it before I start, obviously. But I will go through all of that with you next week. The video should be out next Friday. I'm actually kind of not really looking forward to quilting it because next week they're predicting really hot temperatures because it's summer here in Australia, and I don't particularly like quilting when it's really hot because it's just horrible and sticky and gross. But we'll see what happens. I will try my very best to get as much done as I can to show you what I've been doing, obviously. But until then, keep sharing your blocks with me, and please start sharing your quilt tops with me. I cannot wait to see what they all look like. I'm so excited, like literally I am just buzzing. So until then, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you another time very soon. Bye! And final block that we will be making for our quilt along is this one. It is called Wind Blown Square. I do have to say it really slowly, otherwise I trip all over it with my words. So this is what the Wind Blown Square looks like. I really quite love it.